Continue with the Digital Innovation Day. This is a space for debate in which we talk about telecommunication services, the internet, and broadband. We talk about digital transformation. We're having quite the amazing day. We have panelists. We started with Mario Cimoli and Enrique Vargas from the CEGIF, who this is an event that was sponsored by the Ibero-American Secretariat, who organizes the President Summit every year. This is actually their 30th anniversary with the ICLAC, specifically with the ILA unit, which strives for digital innovation in Latin America, and of course with the support of Huawei. So my deepest gratitude to these three entities. Now, in just a minute, we are going to have our stellar event because we have stars amongst ourselves, very stakeholders who are very relevant in Latin America, if you will, who throughout the years have reflected upon the infrastructure of the digital world and connection, but also about digital transformation. With us, we have our friend and director of the Executive Secretariat of the Interamerican Association of Telecommunication, Maryleana. We also have the Vice President of Regulation of Digicel, Annelise Valdes. We also have Ana Valero, great Ibero-American thinker of the digital world and Director of Public Affairs and Regulation from Hispam Telefónica, Ana. We also have Horacio Romanelli, Director of Affairs in Miami. We also have Ángel Melguizo, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and expert for AT&T America. I know that you're in Colombia, so welcome. And José Pablo Rivera, Director of Communications of Liberty America, Costa Rica. Pablo, welcome. So, Maryleana, the floor is yours. Thank you, Fernando, for the introduction to the panel. Good morning, all of you and the audience. Deep thank you to the people in the Ibero-American world and the DPL for inviting me to moderate the session on innovative services for digital transformation. As has been said by Jorge Fernando, we will talk about the achievements and proposals of the telecommunications professionals in order to bet on innovation to ensure the digital transformation that the countries in Latin America need to go back to this path of growth, economic growth post-pandemic. We have a deluxe panel with us and with people from all over the world that have a lot of experience in telecommunications. Welcome, Ana, Horacio, Ángel, José Pablo, and Annelise. Thank you for being part of this. So we will start with Ángel, who, as Jorge Fernando pointed out, from Violatam, and I congratulate you for your recent promotion and opening up the panel, how the things of the digital transformation happen throughout the region. Welcome and thank you on behalf of and I'm so happy to see that we are in a panel that has a lot of presence from all genders, and I'm happy to see that we need to celebrate this form of gender equality, and the next organizers should also take note of this, the fact that there are women and men who are just as prepared as each other for this. So as said Kamala Harris, she tweeted a few months that broadband will be the new form of electricity. It is how important the digital transformation is and how the reactivation of our economies in Latin America should happen in a digital level or not. But we have many tasks to do, to complete, especially when we want to complete better the users. And when it comes to the skills and competencies and transformation for the digital world and regulation, we need to act upon these affairs and axioms. And I give you 5 pillars that I believe are the most of concern. I hope that you can actually listen to me. These are very uncomfortable truths, if you will. 5 of them. First off, investment in telecommunications per inhabitant in Latin America is decreasing. In 2020, it was less than 2019. In this year, when we thought that digital transformation had accelerated due to COVID, is unfortunately not being translated into the statistics. And we don't see it happening in quite the time. And this is a consequences that we see because unfortunately Latin America is investing 7 times less than the United States and 9 times less than Europe and 9 times less than China. And the second thing is that the investment for digital world is usually not the best. So that means that all countries have a digital agenda per se, but in Latin America, according to the analysis of the OCDE, only 1 out of 3 agendas have an actual budget for it, and we know how important that is. And we talk about that just 5 million US, we would bridge the gap of connectivity in Latin America. And we have estimated more than that, the need of investment to connect the people and the future without taking into account the investment in human capital that we would usually have. In many an occasion, that digital transformation is connected to connectivity per se. So in Latin America, 90% of companies will use the internet, but only half of them use internet to actually buy raw materials or supplies. If we don't go, we go further than that, how many companies use data as an opportunity of business to grow and to increase their productivity and processes, the percentages would be abysmal too. Would be dismal too. And the fourth truth is that there are a few legal loopholes, regulation loopholes. The digital world is changing how we study, how we do banking, how we do all sorts of things. But unfortunately, regulation and institutions are not tackling it as they should, especially when it comes to safety and privacy of data, the protection of intellectual property, and other things that deal with piracy, for instance. They're not dealing with that. And the uncomfortable truth number 5 is that many Latin American countries, we see initiatives of policies in the economic and connectivity worlds that are based in good intentions, but they ignore incentives. And what we know is that when we have good rules and good incentives and good and strong institutions in Latin America by ourselves, especially the telecommunications companies invest more. I'm sorry for tooting my own horn, but you cannot, think as if you were an island. We are a continent. We saw that those Latin American countries that actually have good regulation and strong institutions will have up to 64 more percent of investment in telecommunications than others. So it's not just words; it's actual facts. I am concerned, but I am optimistic. I believe that we can and we should take the leap of faith. And in my second intervention, I will focus specifically on the priorities. Thank you, Angela. I believe that you truly paint a picture as to where we're going to be discussing with the fellow panelists. Clearly, as how Angel was saying, telecommunication networks are the basis of transformation and innovation. The business of telecommunication is that of being regulated, of course, and this is why I would like to hear from you, Horacio. How does regulation influence in Latin America, especially for commercial innovation for the companies that are part of the telecommunications world? Thank you, Maryleana. Thank you to the Interamerican Secretariat for this invitation, DPL Group and Huawei. I express my gratitude to my colleagues whom we see often, by the way. So regarding your question, innovation is key to impulse digital adoption. The subject that we have in the context of pandemic and post-pandemic is to accelerate connectivity and to maintain these economies active and connected to our all communities. I want to point out innovation from the perspective of the client. This is something that we have seen during the pandemic. Over 50% of our user base, at least once a month, will be using a self-service applications for transactions. These are digital adoptions that happened actually only during the pandemic. Digital charges actually increased about a 50% in month per month, especially in higher denominations. And we have achieved the penetrations of up to 2 digits in several countries. And these things that happen on a monthly basis have reached up to 30% in certain countries, and they have become better in the digital world. And the index of client services, client care, has increased as well due to technologies that have been associated and that we have to could attend to the needs of. So the users have innovated, and that has forced us to innovate in turn. This is why we need to have a regulatory framework that is favorable to innovation, that can provide us these benefits and synergies that have been presented by the client. And also from the government itself, we have seen things in Latin America. We have seen cases of commercial innovation and things that we have seen. For instance, in many countries, a few tax regulations have been defrayed or completely removed. Some regulatory needs as well, especially with Colombia, with the TIC fund. And in the case of Colombia, the automatic approval of after 30 days of, for instance, maybe a summons, we have had a positive result for that, and therefore this is regulation that is good for investment. And Colombia has allowed us to have this megahertz network, and Panama, where they have assigned us a temporary effect to phase the peaks of demand that happened during the pandemic. And in the industry also reacted and connected thousands of students without cost so that they can remotely face education. And all these are all positive effects that favor investment, and they can be quantifiable, in the end. We have new operators that can actually offer unlimited free services to people who didn't have a connection during the times of crisis. And from the critical standpoint of regulation, we have also seen negative aspects in which certain obligations have yet of coverage that we had in certain countries had yet to be eliminated. Coverage demands that couldn't be fulfilled, and also authority fulfillments that couldn't be taken care of either. And we have yet to see an improvement in the conditions in which we can import, economically speaking, terminals that could have improved connectivity of people. However, against all odds and logic, even, we put a lot of emphasis in the development of 5G networks. And unfortunately, 5G is not something that Latin America is ready for, because we still have to complete 4G network, which and 5G will come to Latin America, but unfortunately what we do is we defray those resources that were developed by 4G and taken into the 5G. Everybody wants now digitalization, everybody wants coverage, but the government, who should be the body that promotes this, does not capitalize their own processes within this form of digitization. And so in this ecosystem that we had to come into, we always said, well, the state wanted to promote a connectivity, but we haven't done so from its own example. And these are the trends that are worrisome and troublesome to us, but they also impact us, especially the trend that we see of taxing the industry in a very important manner, especially in these times of deficit, in which we've seen the creation of new tax figures, and they're being debated still. Latin America is one of the most affected regions in the crisis, and however, the way in which we will act These months will be fundamental to define the future of the region. We all need to contribute and focus on the next decade to bridge the gap that exists in Latin America, and we know the benefits that it has brought about. In terms of growth of the GDP, telecommunications is a cross-cutting sector, and that is their main benefit that they bring to economies. We need to look into the telecommunications sector as a sector that is only taxable and in which we only want profit. Quite the opposite. We need to develop the networks and bridge that digital gap. We need to promote a change and make sure that these investments are pro us too. Thank you, Horacio. Truly, the need to place these incentives in the correct manner for investment and development is very important. And we can also say that there will be no effective digital transformation without having benefits for every single person that inhabits our region. And this is why I want to ask you, Anna, what public policies and business climate are appropriate for the creation of, to make sure that we can bridge the gap in Latin America? Thank you, Mariana, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this debate with colleagues that are experts in their subject matter and are people that I also love and care for because we've known each other for so long. And something that we have learned in the pandemic has to do with the relevance of digitization. And what we want to convey to the governments and to other industry on the relevance of digitization, the importance of advancing in bridging the digital gap has to do with a discourse that we believe every relevant stakeholder has at least bought. And the importance of digitization, the importance of it reaching everybody, and connectivity is a key element for the basis of digitization, has to extend to reach everybody. And this is something that is now an affair of every single regulator and government. Maybe what we as operators have are missing is how we can approach and convince the relevance of decreasing the bridge gap can translate to specific public policies that foment this development, that can encourage this development of connectivity. So what elements can be key to facilitate connectivity and to guarantee bridging the gap? Well, first off, and starting from the basis of it all and referencing that to what has been said by Ángel, I believe it has to do with judicial certainty and safety, so that operators and the governments can bring resources to us so that we can bridge the gap. That is a fundamental element. In many countries of the region, over the past 3 years, we have seen measures that have put into question the financial sustainability of the industry. And this, of course, has an impact in investment. We should not forget that industry and operators compete with other sectors, with other countries in getting resources for investment, and having judicial certainty that accompanies us with the cases of investment is fundamental to continue to attract the resources. Now, other than certainty, we also need the public policies that are specific to the industry going hand in hand with us, in the right direction. That has to do with everything with the use of spectrum and the costs of the spectrum as a key element that incites in the capability of generating resources for the operators. And we believe that is also an important element. Going from a cash payment to digital currency makes sense, but we have to stem from reasonability and feasibility. In the end, the costs impact all, and we need to be aware of that. And everything that has to do with the fiscal affairs and taxing is a fundamental aspect, not only from our perspective in the taxing that we suffer, but also the taxing that our clients go through, and that has to do with a key element, which is payability, affordability, which is something that, because unfortunately these taxing has been strong on us to provide services that would be cheaper to the client, but haven't been because that they brought about new costs. In the end, we want them to be better in their capabilities to do and improve their businesses. And at last but not at least, we also have an important challenge that has to do with facilitating the deployment of infrastructure. We're still finding a lot of regulation that don't make a whole lot of sense. Some of them are obsolete, and they establish a lot of prerequisites to getting licenses and permits to install infrastructure, and also are very time heavy. And time is of the essence too. If we want to advance in bridging the gap, we need agile public policies and make decisions that truly accompany the needs that we have for communication. And at last, I wanted to point out something that I believe is key as well, and that is the need of joint ventures, not only from the regulator per se and the government, but also other areas within the government in every single part of public administration that could be important to improve digital aspects. And what comes to mind is public policies that have to do with education, those that have to do with health, those that have to do with helping in the continuity of some public services, and even the adoption of digitization within governance. These are key elements that will help us in advancing further towards digitization, and they will help us so that the cases of use for the deployment of infrastructure, especially in most remote areas, would make sense. I believe that working together within the private sector and the public sector in thinking of projects in their feasibility, in facilitating deployment and stewarding resources are all key aspects that we need to focus on. And that is all for me at the time being. Thank you, Anna. Anna has pointed out a few challenges that we need to tackle is in order to digitize with inclusivity in mind. And we now are going to go to new markets. I'm going to start with Jose Pablo. Jose Pablo, from your perspective, which would be the main barriers for technological innovation, the extension of connectivity that companies need to overcome in the Costa Rican market? Good morning, Maryleana, and all the colleagues in the panel. I'm thankful for this invitation on behalf of the organizers, and greetings on behalf of Liberty America. It is important to contextualize and put it into a certain dimension the rapid growth of the telecommunications market in Costa Rica, in our country. We must remember that Costa Rica is pretty much the last country that became part of telecommunications coalition in 2010 in the Latin American continent. And this is true that in some of it, in its subsectors, we've seen some backlog in terms of relegated networks that are still remain, especially due to the deployment of monopolies. And the mobile sector also allowed for a quick deployment that wouldn't have advanced throughout the region if it weren't for them. So I believe that Costa Rica was the first country in Latin America in which the totality of their mobile deployments actually had 4G. It happened in 2014, if I remember correctly, and this created an environment of early innovation. And the proof is in the pudding. We have a trend that happened even before the pandemic that has been reinforced, of course, through the need of digitization. And that is because the pandemic has forced us to do. That is in the case of our mobile operations, which entered in the market in 2011. About 86% of the user contacts happened through digital channels. So the first point the first starting point is that we find ourselves in a market in which innovation has happened digitally from over a decade. However, we still have a lot of room to cover still. as you mentioned at the beginning, Mariana, and although it is true that connectivity is still the basis, the core of the business of telecommunications, the operators can no longer sit on their laurels and see themselves as a commodity of the digital ecosystem. So this connectivity from its own basis offered to the different niches of market needs to be accompanied by digital solutions and added value. The solutions like machine learning, big data, and Internet of Things, and though they might seem a bit incipient and far away, far-fetched, as we implement new household implementations, I believe that the big companies will actually begin with them, especially when it comes to business affairs. So we now are converging more in services that will provide this form of innovation in which we distinguished clearly mobile and fixed services. Now we are things that intermix, and what used to be a predominantly fixed service like cable television is now a service that is being now provided in the communication sector. So through this situation of convergence and confluence in the needs of finding leverage and leveraging through the adding new services, I believe that there are two things that we can reflect upon and are valid for Costa Rica and for pretty much every other country in the region. What is the role that the public policies in the sector have with one another in order to create a framework of information? I believe that briefly, from a perspective of sectorial engagement, it seems as if it were a lie that even in this environment and with the clear existence of many other systems or players and operators within this ecosystem, we can see regulatory efforts that we still need to establish regulations that are 1.0 sextant regulation, especially with the offer of interconnection and regulatory bodywork. And even in many countries in tax regimes that are usually strongholds to generate innovation that limits the offer of operators. And so we see analyze what is happening in Europe and the United States. The regulators have understood that from a practical perspective, the effects of a market that is free above that of the operators themselves does generate effects in competition and therefore effects for the user. So any sextant regulation has to be done with the operators in mind, thinking or leaving aside the old paradigms of offer. And the yet another reflection regarding public policies is that although it might seem that there is an understanding from the operators in public policies as to how the dynamics of the market occur, especially for the market of the digital ecosystem, we have created new models of businesses and the eruption and consolidation of businesses over the top that can be confluent and concurrent and that have pressured in a way the gap that exists between the evolution of the coming into of services from the operators and the need of investment that society needs. Therefore, a country that doesn't understand that reality will not be able to adopt its public policies in any form or field, whether it is fiscal or otherwise, to include other forms of players within the ecosystem. And therefore, this country will not be able to create an environment that is apt for these changes and therefore for improvement and growth of technology. I believe that in the case of Costa Rica, we are in a market in which the authorities have had the vision to see an agenda of growth in favor of better innovation in the market, in which we will see a series of adjustments in regards to these regulations that have maybe unfaced from our needs, but will serve as framework to entice any form of investment. And I believe that integration has happened in Costa Rica. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Costa Rica is participating late to the competition, and it has the advantage that the legal framework is a lot more friendly to the business than others that are anchored in the 90s. And as we continue with our discussion, we can go to the countries where Digicel is present, and there are many of them, and they're diverse. So we would like to know, Annelise, how would you consider the advances of digital transformation in the countries where you're providing services? And is there any experience that you want to underscore? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to the meeting organizers and all my colleagues here. It's a pleasure to see you. And hopefully I'm going to be able to see you very soon. We miss you. We really miss you. At Digicel, we have a market diversity. We have presence in different countries in Central America, Panama, Salvador, and this has been a completely different transformation process in both markets. I believe that to speak about digital transformation in our countries, it was something that we were all trying to achieve, that we were looking at this like, look at the example of the European countries, look at the United States, and this was not going to happen, not in the short term. But as of the pandemic and trying to look at this under a positive light because there's so many negative ones, but looking into the positive, everybody just took off after the digital world. This was the main agent that was accelerating the implementation, the digital procedures with respect to try to debureaucratize the procedures. Panama was the first one to come up with the digital agenda, trying to look for active solutions. And let's remember, we cannot stay behind. There's so many processes that we said we need to make investments, high investments from our main offices, trying to modernize the process. There's no other way about it. We have to look for this. We have to implement the process for transformation throughout our companies. This is something not only for the government that had to implement digital agendas, but also we had to go through learning and to realize that the internal processes that could be taken digital, we didn't have to because it was not, in sense of urgency. We can see how the government started with virtual hearings at administrative levels and civil hearings, labor ones, and this was very innovative for us. E-signatures that in Panama was implemented a few years ago, nobody wanted to use it. The entity that issues the e-signature, it's a long lines. Nobody wanted, and now everybody wants it. Everybody really wants it. And with respect to this, the only way to try to do this and try to learn from the public sector and private sector through virtual education, then how effective this system was to the new innovative ways. And for our children to learn at school, we can also talk about the methods of attention, customer service. It was just something that we unheard of, that the government could take care of you. All of that was implemented, not only in Panama, Salvador. We can see the different limitations for which we saw that the technology really helped to move on, to continue, to walk, and for our countries to be there. So another important topic was that the government acknowledged finally the topic about the importance of communication sector and the crisis of the pandemic. Not only are we companies that pay taxes, we're here to operate at a concession. We were a basic pillar for the service, for the connectivity throughout the pandemic, and we still are. And that has been an extremely important learning opportunity for the government. We have been able to get closer to them, and we have been working hard in Panama, the Caribbean, Salvador, with the governments to guarantee agreements, to guarantee connectivity with a serious commitment within our process. We still need to look at digital transformation. There's so many ideas, the digital agenda. We want to look at an agreement that is subscribed between the operators. We really have started, we have been able to see that just our survival skills, the experience, we had to change, we had to transform in digital processes. And with this, we have changed our mentality for all the parties involved, and we hope, we trust, particularly in the small countries where we have seen big changes, not only health-wise, but access, because there's no broadband access to the different parties. But we have to learn from the benefits achieved, and we hope that this open to complement the digital agenda and to be able to close the digital divide through the transformation processes. Thank you. Yes, Annelise reminds us how this mandatory migration to the digital area has made the governments and the companies, the education system, it has made them make an effort to try to keep the services in a digital manner, and also that the governments have acknowledged how essential the connectivity services are. Annelise has shown us how this is not only something that should stay in the good wishes, but measures that really help us to improve the conditions of each and every market. We start with a second round of questions. In this round, we want to look at the proposals, the specific proposals that the governments may want to adopt. We start with Horacio. From your point of view, if you had to choose, what is a critical area where you have to act immediately to look at the technology innovation in Latin America? Thank you, Maryleana. How to achieve technology innovation, and I see some important pieces here. Economic reactivation is necessary to create funds and resources for the innovation. And all of this is based on a continuous investment fund. Number two, it's important to have a clear legal framework that is updated, that can be foreseen in the investment in the long term, and that also promotes collaboration and spaces for the public-private collaboration, particularly for the very difficult problems that we're facing to connect the last part of the people that are disconnected, that is more complex, and competitive markets, because these are the ones that promote innovation better. They provide direct benefit to the client, and that has to be done in an environment of healthy growth, and that can allow long-term growth. These factors, as I said, are linked to innovation. Sustained investment allows for advances in resources and funds that are the ones that update the technology changes. In the regulatory framework, pro-investment, this allows for the technologies to be there, to be used for what they were designed to do. And particularly, I want to give you a quick example. In some countries, it's not allowed by the regulator. WhatsApp services to the users. And this is a reality. So we have obsolete regulations that make us to be tied to systems that are not efficient today. And we have so many more tools available to do it in a competitive market that facilitates a healthy competition where the operators invest aggressively to get more market share, to create synergies. And as an example, we can mention the investment we have made in Colombia. This was a leap that has given us innovation to diversify the systems that we had. And the idea is that we are able to explore this technology as a new technology. And we were not so familiar either with the idea of lowering cost in the long term and to find ways to cut down on this digital divide challenges. We have more possibilities. This means that we can take the technology to more complex markets. Another area of innovation that is interesting is through electronic means. 70% of our people in our cities, they were not, they do not have banking systems. So in the past year, that grew 20%. So we have about 5 million users connected in Latin America, and they have access to financial services they didn't used to in the past. And this is a basic tool. This is a digital tool, and it's a means for payment that is necessary to go into other services, other digital services that come hand in hand with the digital platform, and not only in our industry, but in every industry. We can quote some examples in Paraguay in the pandemic. They use these, type of e-wallet. In Salvador, businesswomen that have been trained in the use of the e-money. And as a result, they had an increase in their sales, so over 28%. And something else that I want to mention to close, and I think this is very relevant, is that today, all of this has to do with market structure. This has to do with a deep solution. If you want hyper competitive markets where you have a price of the services that is dropping in the short term, but the counterpart is very poor financial results for the companies that provide the services, and as a result, low investment levels for the future. Well, low investment levels in the future, or markets that are smaller, more competitive, likewise, with operators with an investment capacity in the long term. I think this is a basic question that needs to be brought to the table, because let's recall, without investment, there's no type of transformation, there's no network development, there's no digitization. As a result, remember, we are not a cross-sectional sector. If we don't start creating this change, the other sectors are going to be delayed in the digital transformation. That's why it's so important to think and to consider this type of decisions. Thank you, Horacio. Yeah, that's right. Those regulatory environments that should be enablers of a market of competence are basic, are essential for the development. And in this sense, this enabling frameworks have allowed the generation of even rural projects that can be considered today, very innovative. And Anna, I ask you, what incentives help sustainability of rural innovative projects from your point of view? Thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, at Telefónica, we have a really innovative project that is focused in closing the digital gap or the digital divide. And when we consider the key elements in the development of the IPT model in Peru, and that we can facilitate this type of models to go to the other regions, I think we have to start from the need of public policies that provide flexibility for the reality of the rest of the areas, the rural areas. And it's not, something like that, the decision of Telefónica of launching internet for everyone in Peru. The reason for this in the Peruvian regulations for the rural operators with more regulations that allowed flexibility in the development of innovative models for closing the gap. And this has allowed setting this project going, rolling it out. And it's important to underscore that this is a project that we're very proud of at Telefónica. So far, we have been able to take coverage to areas in Peru with 2.3 million people. And this is very important. And this states that, yes, looking for innovative different models, we can move at a speed that we can provide coverage to the sectors that were out of the connectivity grid. And when we're thinking generically speaking, we have to work analyzing what are the obstacles that are finding the development of the innovative projects in the rural areas and try to really tackle this obstacle. We think that regulatory obstacles are relevant. Topics like quality regulation, it might seem something silly. We're trying to impose quality innovation in urban areas, in rural areas where we don't have basic infrastructures. For example, if we want to have service recovery times in rural areas that are far away, remote areas in the same recovery areas as urban areas, well, obviously, we question the feasibility of rural projects. We don't have routes to have access to these areas, or we depend on infrastructures that are basic under a condition with the recovering this service cannot be done in the times that we have set. So, for example, as an important example, in many countries in the region, there's a lot of pressure, and it's okay. We don't want these quality conditions to adapt to those cruel realities. On the other hand, everything that has to do with the regulations, with the looking at the networks and the permits, all of this is so important. Everything that is a burden, delays in rural projects somehow make it difficult for getting these projects going. We have to cut down regulatory burden, the tax burden, and maybe more specific focus in the rural areas where we must accelerate this to make more sense. We think that we must look at this in areas that are key for rural environments. It's important to look at the funds of universal services. How is this conceived? How are we defining the projects? And how is the assessment of the results? When we were looking at Latin America, we had a huge challenge. It has been mentioned many times. A project promoted by the IDB, and the results, we know that there's an opportunity for improvement that is relevant. And we need for these funds to be geared to projects with results to look at the efficiency and the result of the projects that have been set forward, and to look at the way that the resources are, moving forward. In most of the region, this is the resources that have been contributed by the industry, even rural operators that we could know have the obligation of contribution to this fund. This should be a challenge to have this instead of having to go elsewhere. These funds that essentially are the resources from the operators, we can see, and these levels of operation that are very low, but based in the control, the quality, and with the impact of the extension of the services, there's a huge challenge on that side. Is an important challenge to include all the different funds, the direct subsidy to the demand. And in many cases, in many regions in Latin America, all of this is linked to poverty. We have low levels of income here. And to go hand in hand with direct subsidy for this sector to have access to the services, to know the digital world, to know the advantages of being part of the digital world, it looks like an important element to help cut down the gap. Last, I wanted to continue talking about some cases we have in the region about thinking in a similar way. They're about to develop, and we think this is important to have in mind the model of the regulatory frameworks to have a different approach with a regulation that has to do with rural services. And it looks like it's an important background to have on the table. And there's no question that the regulatory framework in Peru and innovation to develop new models. It's no question that there's a model to look at other countries in the region to see if we're capable to set some conditions and with the investment in rural areas that would help us to take to the sectors in the population that are there. As we mentioned, there's no question about the importance of digitization, and I believe we need to work and to insist in the urgency of digitization. It's not about being aware that we need to work, that we need to move forward, but also that we can move forward quickly in the short term with the governments, with the different groups to develop the culture in these areas. Thank you, Anna. For sure, you have a very powerful message, the urgency of digitization. And with this, we can go to the next question that we have for Jose Pablo. And this is, within this process of technology evolution, what are the elements that you consider necessary to promote the 5G ecosystem in Costa Rica? As part of the late historical context that opened telecommunications in our country, there's a very specific feature in this market. The concentration of the spectrum. And this really puts a condition in the future evolution of the situation. In fact, some of the governments have concentrated many efforts in an urgent implementation on 5G services, where there's part of the population that even without having any access on 4G services. In Costa Rica, it's interesting to see that even with the sustained innovation efforts and investment in the deployment of 4G, with a good reach of the population, we have not seen 700 megahertz that could really look into the coverage in rural areas to reach remote areas with a new generation networks. that could have an incidence in this during this pandemic to ensure connectivity, like for the students that have suffered so much. There has been certain statements because of how fast we want to the deployment of fifth generation, when we have a pending in the agenda with from our perspective, and it's in the hands of the state to be able to release the band or make available the 700 band. But also it's true that if maybe we do not see that it's urgent with respect to the deployment of 5G network, that at the commercial level, the entire world, mainly 4 out of 5 commercial launches are done for the FWA, for the fixed wireless networks. And we're thinking that maybe a lot of stakeholders might be thinking that we're going to be migrating in the short term. But what's for sure is, let's take steps. So this implementation is urgent. It's urgent to enable this environment. And we are delayed, particularly with what we have talked about, the concentration of the spectrum in key spectrum for 5G, like the C-band, where pretty much 70% of the band in the country is concentrated in one single operator, and also in 1600, because 190 megahertz are there. And somehow this is the history, and that's how the opening started. And having available the spectrum and trying to really take fragments of the spectrum to bring them into the market. And this creates a huge bottleneck. So the spectrum that we're going to be needing to deploy in the medium term, the network has to be concentrated. So it makes absolutely no sense what we had stated to move forward to a bidding process for some electrical spectrum bands when there's a market player that constitutes 100% of the other bands, and this creates a competitive distortion. And I think this takes me to something that I mentioned before in my prior intervention. It has to do with the understanding of the market situation from the authorities and the relevant stakeholders. To provide incentives and the right signals to generate certainty and legal certainty, and to understand that the resources not only are that they're limited, but they're rival in our own markets. Not understanding this situation can take us to decisions to try to generate a spectrum bidding process in the short term without considering between the decision of any operator, what is their relative position with respect to the spectrum that other operators could have. And if there's a spectrum that is key in the development in the mean term of 5G and it's concentrated, well, the investment decisions go through by considering that risk when the competitive and unbalanced. So the first element is that we must try to rebalance the situation of the spectrum. And its second important element that has to do with what Anna mentioned is that we need to make the obligations lighter with respect to the deployment of infrastructure, particularly in rural areas. We cannot be thinking about deployment of 5G networks if we have areas in our countries where, because of bureaucracy or maybe highly the restricted areas with respect to the costs and different areas that they want to charge by the authorities and the different entities, this is an obstacle that not only is it an obstacle for our current networks, but even more with how critical it is looking at the business cases because of the important investment at the radio and level and other equipment. If the supporting infrastructure has high obstacle and a lot of conditions with respect to taxes and tariffs that have to be paid. So I want to mention about the balance in the spectrum and to facilitate the deployment of the network for transmission and support infrastructure that are necessary to bring in this technology massively.
Yes, truly, spectrum, incentives, the development of infrastructure. These are all essential elements. And Annelise, from the point of view of Digicel, are these very confluent factors? Are they coincident? Are there would be more challenging factors for the deployment of 5G in their markets? I can only coincide with what Jose Pablo has been saying related to the topic of yet do we want 5G? We have yet to finish the implementation and developing of that. That is point number one. And talking with the regulator in Panama regarding a public consultation that happened next year to free this for 5G, we were saying, well, who's going to use it if we have yet to implement the security? The government has finished incentivizing the companies to do this sort of implementation. And a few years ago, government inaugurated inaugurated what we call the Puente Centenario, the Centennial Bridge, which was a spectacular bridge in Panama, but there was no road there. People couldn't use it. So this is exactly the same thing, the same situation. Whether you might have the spectrum for 5G, but who exactly you're going to benefit? Who will truly benefit when it comes to coverage of 5G? Of course, a lot of population, a high percentage of the population. I wouldn't say half of it, but a high percentage of our population don't have access to regular telecommunications, and they have incentivized the affair of investing in these sort of connections. And due to the pandemic, we had to have it. And fortunately, because of it, a lot of even kids haven't had access to the education that they need in a distance. So what we talked to with the regulators is that as long as you elaborate a plan for the development of 5G, we will be able to have a project like the one Anna mentioned, Internet for Everybody in Peru, which should be the priority in the end. Now, going back to 5G, that it's not like we don't have the data. We want to have the most modern and better technology. As you were saying, it had to do with spectrum. The matter of spectrum, for instance, in Panama, has had 5 years of free spectrum, but people wouldn't actually buy it because of although it's free for use, it costs in its maintenance. So therefore, it is very expensive even throughout the pandemic. So there are two things that are linked together: a clear policy as a country and the government alongside with the operators to achieve the coverage and genuine internet use for everybody so that everybody can benefit. All the while we set the basis to have the available spectrum with the affordable prices and not heavy taxation for the operators. We must have a circle of productivity, fifth generation bridges that can actually be used, not the actual bridges that you have there, but nobody can connect to. So this is exactly what we need to work on: public policies, the operators, the government, affordable spectrum prices, liberation of necessary spectra, and of course that deals with the modernizing and updating our regulation, everything that had to do with installing infrastructure as well. So yes, if the government would see that as in the terms of public policy as a good step to take in order to grow, then we would actually achieve that in the measure in which the plan can actually happen in an organized fashion and in benefiting every single citizen throughout the countries of our region. And therefore, their use of the network will bring about productivity in turn. Thank you, Annelise. I believe, Angel, that your five truths were fully developed throughout the panel. And with this question, we close the second round of opinions. What would you propose should be the next steps to truly achieve the benefits of transformation, digital transformation? That is, well, I don't know if this is just my personal opinion, but I started being the person who would actually lay out the truth, uncomfortable truths. But now things have turned over on my side to me. A lot of the colleagues now actually bring the uncomfortable truths, and I now take the seat of the optimistic side. And I'm going to point out the good things that have been happening and how we need to ride the wave of transformation. And Annalise and Horacio have said it. The feat of strength that has been overcome by our operators has been amazing. The agility that the companies and the governments had to achieve change was unheard of. So now it's all about catalyzing and consolidating everything. And how can we achieve this form of mobility through the use of ideas and policies that we need to advance? Two lines that I believe are very important. First off, and it goes in line with what José Pablo was saying. We live in an epoch of a digital economy. We have the telecommunication sectors in the face of others would make little sense. It is all about advancing together and combining in an intelligent manner with a combination of all the sectors. About 15 years ago, Twitter, Rappi, Instagram, Cabify, and any of the entertainment platforms didn't exist. The ones that we, the big companies, have launched. So how do we educate each other? How do we work each other? How do we do things together? Well, the perspective has changed and the rules and our institutions have to follow suit. Transparency and accountability in the use of data and in the use of algorithms is quite clear. We need to have more neutral regulation for comparative services. And it goes with what Anna was saying. There are many things that we know that we don't know. Therefore, we need innovation in terms of regulation, innovation in terms of regulation. And when we don't know exactly what to regulate, then we must create a form of sandbox and we invent together and create as we go. Another aspect that has yet to be mentioned has to be that regulation needs to be regionalized. I don't know how many countries have been connected, but I do know that our users move amongst countries once the world is open again, and there shouldn't be any disparity in terms of regulation and rules. Intelligent regulation is the first basis of it all, and the second one is protection and cooperation. And I'm going to start with a different form of cooperation, private cooperation in and of itself. We need to cooperate with one another more. We have, of course, implemented a lot of efforts, but in many cases, we do that in a non-connected manner. And this is exactly where platforms come in. We need a lot more investment in terms of telecommunications. It's good to know that some of those platforms are part of the internet for all, but we need the entirety of the digital private sector to contribute to this, and of course the public sector as well. I don't want to parrot the ideas of my colleagues. It's not just about the telecommunications, but the other ministers have to become involved. And one last petition: the multilateral sector has to become involved too. We have seen that the Bank of the Interamerican Bank of Development and the presidents of other banks have said these things. They agree. We need our development banks to have more capital. They need more muscle, if you will, to truly afford the solutions that will be put on the table. And I conclude, the good thing is that Latin America in and of itself has made it through. We are leaving the crisis that was brought about by COVID-19. Many of the countries have actually even better economic activity than that of before, but we still have a long ways to go. There's still room to cover. So we're not going to go back to what we had before. We will still have to wait to get the trends back. In terms of growth, we have lost so much, but studies show that we can grow up even twice as much if we continue to go like this. We should continue with this multilateral associations, private and public. We should find a good marketeer for this, but with this association of both forces, we can advance in a political and resource manner. Thank you, Angel. I believe the time has cut us short due to this very enriching discussion. And just a few characters tell us how you would wrap up. You know, you would give us the key elements and how you would wrap up. So let's start, Angel. Just a few. You're privileged. I only get 140. But I believe that we need to be optimistic. Latin America and the Caribbean can and should change digitally. And I believe the advancements towards regulation, digital and intelligent, and associations are public and private will actually take us that way. Horacio, please, your wrap up. To close the digital bridge and to manage to gauge the data that we have and to multiply our efforts as a telecommunications, we need a lot of capital. There will be no innovation or efficient transformation without a flux of cash that is efficient. So we need to remove the barriers of investment to deregulate whenever possible and to have modern, updated regulation that are go in the benefit of deployment and reasonable costs. So briefly, deregulation and investment. Now, Anna, it's your turn. Thank you, Maryleana. I would like us to remember three ideas. First off, the need to innovate for the industry, to bridge the gap, but also for the development of the digital capabilities of our citizens in Latin America. And we also need operation and to unite the forces of the private and public sectors. If we're not all marching towards the same direction, we won't prevail. And at last, but not at least, sustainability. We need to provide sustainability in an economic and judicial level, which will be key for any form of investment. Thank you. Jose Pablo? Thank you, Maryleana. Well, I want to thank everybody within the organization. I think I've already surpassed the 180 characters, but I believe that in reference to the name of this forum, I believe that digital innovation is already in the mindset of our society and our consumers, and that happened in a way forcibly so due to the pandemic. So what we need now is to act accordingly from our part, at least from part of the operators, because any operator that doesn't get involved in this mindset of innovation in the digital world won't see a future. And also, the authorities have to make their part too, especially when we talk about these dynamics of the market, specifically within our region, to truly line up how we're working together. Thank you, and we will close with you, Annelise. Thank you so much. I don't want to be repetitive, but I agree 100% with what our colleagues have been saying, and I believe that this is an opportunity. We have innovated over the past few years, and we have created things that we thought we couldn't do before, and that this effort shouldn't be lost. And we will find a hashtag to your idea, private, which is something that I found extremely interesting. Thank you all. I want to thank our panelists for their enriching participations, and I also want to thank the people who have accompanied us throughout the debate. It was quite the pleasure to spend this time with you. Thank you, DPL and Huawei and others. Please be careful, take care of yourselves, stay safe and healthy.